I was jolted awake by the low, steady hum of the train's wheels clattering against the ancient tracks. The narrow upper berth of the 3RD class carriage had become an uncomfortable prison for my stiff limbs, my back sore from the awkward position I had contorted myself into during the night. The Soviet-era train was a relic, its age evident in the creaks and groans of the carriage as it swayed along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Blinking away the remnants of sleep, I slowly became aware of my surroundings. The air was thick, smelling of damp wool, sweat, and something vaguely metallic. My legs longed for a stretch, but something else nagged at me. A craving. Nicotine. I needed a cigarette. Instinctively, I fumbled for the curtain next to my bunk, pulling it back just a crack to peer outside. It was still early morning. Pale light crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the snow-dusted landscape. The train was coming to a halt at the Krasnoyarsk railway station, a sizable hub on the long journey east. The platform was bathed in the faint blush of dawn, a ghostly quiet settling over the scene as the train hissed to a stop. I swung my legs over the edge of the bunk and dropped to the floor, my feet landing on the cold, hard surface. The carriage was alive with the soft murmurs of passengers stirring from sleep, but most remained cocooned in their own worlds, oblivious to my quiet descent. Reaching into my coat pocket, I pulled out a cigarette and slipped it between my lips, the comforting weight of it momentarily soothing my yearning. As I began to stride down the narrow aisle, I found myself facing a wall of bodies, an unruly mob of Asian passengers, all trying to board the train at once. It was chaos. The group seemed to be moving as one, like a river of human bodies flowing relentlessly into the carriage, each person weighed down by oversized suitcases, cardboard boxes, and bags. The noise was deafening as they hauled their cargo, shouting directions to each other in a language I couldn't understand. The sheer number of them was overwhelming, and I had to push my way through, elbowing past bodies to reach the door. Once outside, the cold morning air hit me like a slap to the face, but it was a welcome contrast to the stuffy, claustrophobic atmosphere inside the carriage. I took a deep drag of my cigarette, feeling the familiar burn in my lungs as I exhaled a cloud of smoke. The platform was almost deserted now, save for a few passengers and a couple of uniformed officials milling about near the train's entrance. I leaned against the railing, taking in the sight of the station's weathered stone arches and faded Soviet insignias. My cigarette was nearly finished when the conductor's voice rang out, echoing across the platform with an urgency that stirred the lingering passengers. "Zahodim, Zahodim," the conductor barked, gesturing for us to board the train again. His voice was rough and impatient, a tone that seemed to say, "We've waited long enough." With a resigned sigh, I flicked the cigarette butt into a nearby bin and made my way back up the train steps. As I entered the carriage again, I noticed the once crowded aisles had emptied, the Asian group now seated or still organizing their belongings into the overhead compartments. I headed back to my seat, but when I arrived, I saw that the space across from me had been claimed by one of the new passengers. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s or late 40s, though it was difficult to tell exactly. He had already stripped down to a pair of faded blue shorts, his bare feet tucked up on the seat as he sat, crouched with a suitcase beside him. His frame was small, even for someone of Asian descent, and his skin was a pallid shade of yellow. A large, worn-out suitcase dominated the small table between us, making it nearly impossible for either of us to move freely. "Shang, Shang," I repeated, pointing alternately between his suitcase and the empty luggage rack overhead. My attempt at speaking Mandarin must have come out clumsily because it took a few repetitions before he understood my meaning. When it clicked, he offered a faint smile and nodded. Together, we lifted the heavy suitcase and hoisted it onto the rack. I settled back into my seat, feeling the train lurch forward as it continued its journey eastward. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about him and the rest of his group. There was a quietness to them, a strange, almost eerie detachment that set them apart from the usual passengers on the Trans-Siberian. It wasn't just their appearance, which was different from the majority of Russian passengers, but the way they carried themselves, with a mixture of timidity and intense curiosity, as if they were simultaneously afraid of and fascinated by their surroundings. I made a few half-hearted attempts to strike up a conversation with him, using a combination of gestures and broken Mandarin, but my efforts were in vain. He didn't seem to understand much, if anything, of what I was saying. After a while, I gave up and retreated into my thoughts, staring out the window as the endless Siberian wilderness blurred past us. The hours melted together in the monotonous rhythm of the train's motion. The Siberian taiga stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of dark green pine trees that occasionally gave way to frozen rivers or clusters of wooden houses huddled against the cold. The vastness of the landscape made time feel irrelevant, as if the train was moving not through hours and minutes, but through a boundless expanse of solitude. By late afternoon, the light outside had dimmed, and a creeping chill had settled into the carriage. I climbed back up to my berth, leaving my mysterious travel companion to arrange the seats below into his bed. The night passed in a restless blur of half-sleep and brief moments of consciousness, the rhythmic sway of the train lulling me back into a fitful slumber. It was morning again when I awoke to the piercing brightness of sunlight streaming through the window. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I glanced down to see that the older man had already dismantled his bed and was sitting in his usual position, staring blankly out at the passing scenery. I slid down from my berth and took my seat across from him, mimicking his posture as I gazed out the window. What greeted me outside was nothing short of breathtaking. We were traveling along the southern shore of Lake Baikal, the largest freshwater lake in the world. Its enormous surface seemed to stretch into infinity, a shimmering expanse of deep blue water that mirrored the sky above. A golden stripe of sunlight cut across the lake, sparkling in the morning light as the waves gently lapped against the rocky shoreline. Beyond the lake, rolling green hills rose in the distance, their slopes dotted with pine trees that climbed toward jagged mountain peaks. "Beautiful nature," my companion said suddenly, his voice catching me off guard. His Russian was heavily accented, but clear enough to understand. Surprised, I nodded, offering a smile. "Yes, it is," I replied, feeling a small spark of connection in that brief exchange. He had been so quiet throughout the journey that I hadn't expected him to speak at all, let alone in Russian. Encouraged by his sudden willingness to converse, I asked him where he was from. "Greece," I answered, hoping the name of my country would be familiar to him. But he only stared at me blankly, the words seemingly lost on him. "Zila," I tried again, using the Chinese word for Greece. Still, there was no recognition. Frustrated but determined, I pulled out my phone and opened a map, pointing to Greece on the screen. His face lit up with understanding, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Ah, Greece," he said slowly, as if testing the unfamiliar word. "I am from North Korea," he said after a pause, his voice quieter now as if the admission carried some weight. "North Korea." The revelation sent a jolt of surprise through me. I had heard of North Korean workers being sent abroad for labor, but I had never imagined I'd encounter one on a train in the middle of Siberia. The realization that the group of Asians I had struggled to navigate earlier were likely all North Koreans dawned on me. In the days that followed, we became unlikely companions, forging a fragile connection over broken Russian and makeshift gestures. His name, as I learned, was Jae-sung. Despite the language barrier, we managed to communicate, often using his tiny notebook, a homemade Korean-Russian dictionary that he kept tucked away in his jacket, and the occasional assistance from Google Translate whenever the signal allowed it. Our conversations were careful and often limited to mundane topics, the weather, the landscape, and life on the train. But as the miles passed beneath us, Jae-sung began to share more about his life, each piece of information offered cautiously, as if he were testing the waters of trust. One evening, as the train rocked gently along the tracks, he told me about his work in Russia. North Korea, he explained, had a deal with the Russian government to send workers for large construction projects. This was his fourth trip to Russia, and, like the others, it would last anywhere from 6 months to a year. The work was brutal, 17 to 20 hours a day, every day of the week, with little time for rest or leisure. And the pay? A mere 500 rubles a day, of which half went directly to the North Korean government. It sounded like a nightmare, but to Jae-sung, it was a small fortune compared to what he would earn back home. Nothing. He explained that the money he made in Russia was sent back to his family in Pyongyang, where it could be used to buy small luxuries like extra food, clothes, or perhaps even a rare treat like a piece of foreign candy for his daughters. At one point during our conversation, he reached into his coat and carefully pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to me with a reverence that suggested it was one of his most prized possessions. The photo showed his family, his wife and 2 young daughters, standing in front of a plain, nondescript wall. Above them hung a framed portrait of Kim Jong-un, smiling benevolently down at them. "They wait for me," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and longing. His eyes lingered on the photograph for a moment before he gently took it back, tucking it safely into his jacket. But for all the pride he had in his family, there was a constant shadow that hung over his words. He mentioned in hushed tones that among his group of workers there was always a snitch, a government-appointed informant who was tasked with reporting on any signs of reactionary behavior. No one knew exactly who the snitch was, but the mere possibility that someone was always watching and listening kept them all in line. The fear was palpable, a heavy, invisible weight that pressed down on them at all times. Talking to me, a foreigner, was risky. If he spoke too freely, if he was seen interacting too much with someone like me, it could raise suspicion. Yet, despite the danger, he continued to talk to me, perhaps drawn by the rare opportunity to connect with someone from the outside world, a world so foreign to him that it might as well have been another planet. As the train rolled further east, our conversations grew deeper, more introspective. One night, as we sat in silence, watching the stars twinkle outside the window, he passed me his notebook again. This time, he had written something different, something that felt far more personal than any of our previous exchanges. In shaky Russian script, he had scrawled, "You must help. Your country must help. The world must help." I stared at the words for a long moment, the weight of them sinking into me. There was a desperation in his plea, a quiet acknowledgement of the hopelessness of his situation. I wanted to respond, to say something that might offer comfort or hope, but the truth was I had no answer. I wasn't a diplomat or a politician. I was just a traveler passing through. The world wasn't so simple, and we both knew it. The rest of our journey passed in relative quiet. There were moments when we would exchange small talk, pointing out interesting sights or commenting on the changing landscape, but there was always an unspoken tension between us, a shared understanding that our worlds were fundamentally different. On the last night of our journey together, a new passenger boarded the train at one of the smaller stations along the route. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with long black hair and a kind face. After exchanging a few words, I learned that she was from South Korea, traveling across Russia on her way to Europe. When I returned to my seat, Jae-sung asked me about her. "Where is she from?" he inquired, his voice tinged with curiosity. "South Korea," I replied casually, not thinking much of it. His reaction was immediate and stark. His face tightened and a look of alarm flashed in his eyes. "No," he muttered, shaking his head vigorously. "I must not talk to her. Very wrong." "Why?" I asked, genuinely puzzled by his sudden change in demeanor. "Ideology," he said, pointing to his notebook, his expression serious. It was the first time he had openly acknowledged the strict ideological control that governed his life. In North Korea, South Korea was the enemy, and any contact with a South Korean could be seen as a betrayal of his country's values. It was a sobering reminder of the immense divide between our worlds, a chasm so deep that even a simple conversation could be fraught with danger for him. In the early hours of the morning, as the train slowed to a stop at a small, obscure station, I felt the presence of movement in the carriage. I was half awake, my mind still groggy with sleep, when I heard the sound of footsteps and the soft shuffle of luggage being moved. By the time I fully came to my senses, the North Korean group, including Jae-sung, had disembarked. I sat up in my bunk, blinking at the empty space across from me. The carriage was quiet now, the only sounds the distant murmur of other passengers and the faint hum of the train's machinery. Jae-sung was gone. There had been no farewell, no parting words. He and his companions had vanished as quietly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the memory of our unlikely connection. As I stared out the window, watching the dark silhouettes of trees and mountains pass by in the pre-dawn light, I couldn't help but wonder what would become of him. Would he return to North Korea, to his family and the life of hardship that awaited him? Or would he one day find a way to escape the invisible chains that bound him to a regime that controlled every aspect of his existence? I would never know. But as the train rolled on into the endless expanse of Siberia, I carried with me the memory of our brief time together, a fleeting connection between two strangers from worlds that were never meant to meet.